Sophia, a 22-year-old woman with quiet, hopeful eyes, lived in a grand house in Accra with her father, Anthony, her stepmother, Felicia, and her younger brother, Jordan. Her mother had died when she was just a baby, leaving her without a mother's love. But perhaps even worse, her father Anthony had never shown her any affection. He saw her as a burden and a reminder of the arranged marriage that had trapped him in a life he didn't want. To Anthony, Sophia was invisible, while Jordan, his son with Felicia, was the apple of his eye. Felicia, once warm, had turned bitter over the years. She saw Sophia as a nuisance and made her do all the household chores, even though they had maids. Jordan, spoiled by his parents, often sneered at Sophia, mocking her for her quiet obedience. "Papa doesn't care about you," Jordan would say with a cruel smile. "You're just a shadow in this house." Sophia lived in silence, her heart aching for the love she had never known. She would sit by her bedroom window at night, gazing at the stars, dreaming of a life where she was seen, loved, and cherished. One evening, Sophia overheard her father on the phone. His voice was tense, and she could tell from his words that the family business was in deep trouble. Anthony had invested heavily in risky deals, and they had failed. Panic filled the house, and Sophia knew her life was about to change. The next morning, Anthony called her into his office. His face was tight with stress, but his eyes were cold. "You're going to marry Emmanuel," he said flatly. "He's agreed to save the company if you marry him." Sophia's heart dropped. Emmanuel was a name she had heard before, a wealthy businessman known for his power, but also for his cold, distant demeanor. But that wasn't the worst part. Rumors had spread that Emmanuel had been in an accident years ago and now used crutches to walk. "Father, please," Sophia begged, her voice trembling. "I don't know him. I don't want to marry someone for business. I want to marry for love." Anthony's expression darkened. "You don't have a choice. If you refuse, you'll be out on the streets with nothing. This is your only chance." Felicia entered the room, her lips curling into a smile. "You should be grateful. It's the only way you'll ever be worth anything to this family." Jordan snickered from the hallway. "You'd better marry him. Who else would want you?" Sophia felt trapped, suffocated by the weight of her family's indifference. There was no escape. The wedding was arranged quickly, and the day felt like a blur, a life-changing event she had no control over. After the ceremony, Sophia moved into Emmanuel's grand estate. The house was beautiful but cold, much like her new husband. Emmanuel spent most of his time in his study, poring over business documents or on endless phone calls. He hardly spoke to her, only offering curt nods or brief acknowledgments when they crossed paths. The servants in the house, sensing the coldness between the couple, treated Sophia with little regard. They whispered behind her back, assuming that she was just another young woman there for the wealth. Sophia had gone from being ignored in her father's house to being invisible in her husband's. She was trapped in a life she hadn't chosen, married to a man she barely knew, and the walls of the grand estate felt like a gilded prison. Days turned into weeks, and the silence between them deepened. Emmanuel's injury had left him bitter, and it was clear he preferred to rely on his crutches than on anyone else. His pride, wounded as much as his body, kept him distant. Sophia, sensing his reluctance to let her in, didn't push him. Late one evening, as Sophia sat by the window of her room, watching the moonlight cast shadows over the vast garden, she heard a sound. It was the rhythmic thump of crutches against the marble floors. Emmanuel was walking down the hallway, slower than usual, the strain of his injury audible in each step. Curious and concerned, Sophia quietly stepped out of her room and followed the sound. She found Emmanuel in the grand sitting room, standing by the large window that overlooked the estate's sprawling grounds. The moonlight bathed him in a silvery glow, and for the first time he seemed less imposing, more human. He stood there, his broad shoulders slightly hunched, leaning heavily on his crutches. His usual cold expression had softened, replaced by something else, something that looked like weariness, or perhaps even sadness. Sophia hesitated at the doorway, unsure whether to speak, but something inside her urged her forward. "Emmanuel," she said softly, her voice breaking the stillness of the room. He didn't turn to look at her, but his grip on the crutches tightened. "What is it?" he asked, his tone clipped but lacking the harshness she had grown used to. She took a few steps closer, gathering her courage. I just wanted to check on you. You seem tired." Emmanuel let out a bitter laugh, though it was barely audible. "Tired," he repeated, as if the word didn't quite capture the weight of what he felt. "You could say that." Sophia bit her lip, unsure of how to continue. She could feel the emotional distance between them as clearly as the physical space that separated them, but she had to try. "You don't have to go through this alone, you know," she said, her voice soft but steady. "We're married now. We should be partners, even if this wasn't what either of us planned." At her words, Emmanuel finally turned to face her. His eyes, usually so cold and distant, were filled with a complexity of emotions, anger, frustration, but also a deep, aching sorrow. "I didn't ask for this," he said quietly, his voice shaking slightly. "This marriage, this life, none of it. And I certainly didn't ask for pity." Sophia's heart ached at his words, but she held her ground. "I'm not offering pity," she replied gently. "I'm offering my support. I know we barely know each other, but maybe we could try to make the best of this." Emmanuel looked at her for a long moment, his dark eyes searching her face for any sign of insincerity. Finally he sighed, his defenses lowering just a little. "It's not that simple," he muttered, looking down at the floor. "You don't know what it's like to lose everything that made you who you are. I used to be strong, independent. Now I'm just this." He gestured to his crutches with a bitter frown, his frustration palpable. Sophia stepped closer, her voice gentle but firm. "You're still strong, Emmanuel. Maybe not in the same way you were before, but that doesn't mean you're less of a person." Emmanuel's gaze flickered with something, surprise perhaps, or a flicker of hope, but it vanished as quickly as it had appeared. He shook his head, clearly unwilling to believe her words. "I don't need your help," he said quietly, turning back toward the window, his expression closing off again. Sophia knew she had reached the edge of what he was willing to reveal tonight. But even though he had pushed her away, she had glimpsed a part of him that wasn't as cold or unreachable as she had first thought. He was hurting more deeply than she had realized, and while he wasn't ready to let her in just yet, she could see that the walls he had built around himself weren't as impenetrable as they seemed. "I'll be here when you're ready," Sophia said softly, before turning and leaving the room. The following days were much the same. Emmanuel remained distant, spending his time either in his study or outside by the garden, walking slowly with his crutches. But something had shifted. He no longer completely ignored Sophia when she spoke to him, and though their conversations were brief and often guarded, she felt that he was beginning to trust her, even if only a little. One evening, while walking through the mansion, Sophia overheard Emmanuel talking to his father. His voice, usually composed and emotionless, cracked with frustration. Emmanuel had been hiding a deep wound from his past. His fiancée had left him years ago when he had the accident, and his business was struggling, abandoning him for someone wealthier. That betrayal had shattered his ability to trust, leaving him cold and detached. Sophia felt a pang of empathy for him. She knew all too well what it felt like to be discarded, unloved, and unwanted. The next day, she cautiously approached Emmanuel while he worked. "I know you don't trust me," Sophia said softly, "but I've lived my whole life feeling unwanted, just like you." Emmanuel looked at her for a long moment, the hardness in his eyes softening ever so slightly. He didn't reply, but something shifted between them that day. A small crack formed in the walls he had built around himself. "I've been thinking," she said quietly, glancing over at Emmanuel. "Maybe we could start over, get to know each other, without all the expectations or the pressure of this arrangement." Emmanuel looked at her for a long moment, his eyes searching hers. For the first time since they'd married, there was no trace of anger or bitterness in his gaze, only exhaustion and perhaps a hint of curiosity. "Start over?" he asked, his tone skeptical but not entirely dismissive. Sophia smiled softly. "Yes. No more pretending, no more walls, just us, trying to figure this out." Emmanuel didn't respond right away. He looked down at his crutches, then back at Sophia. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he nodded. "All right," he said quietly, "but don't expect it to be easy." Sophia's smile widened, and for the first time in weeks, she felt a small glimmer of hope. "I won't," she replied, "but I think it's worth trying." And with that, the ice between them began to melt, slowly but surely. As the days turned into weeks, Sophia and Emmanuel began to spend more time together. Their conversations became less strained, more open. Emmanuel started sharing pieces of his life before the accident, his passions, his dreams, that had been shattered along with his body. In return, Sophia told him about her own struggles, the loneliness of her childhood, the way she had always been overlooked, even by her own family. Little by little, they started to understand each other, and though the journey was far from over, they were no longer strangers bound by a loveless marriage. They were beginning to build something real, a fragile bond of trust, and perhaps one day something more. For now, that's enough. Sophia sighed. One day, Emmanuel received a letter from a renowned surgeon who specialized in treating chronic injuries. Emmanuel had been living with pain ever since a car accident years ago, an injury that contributed to his distant and bitter attitude. The surgery was risky, but it offered a chance to heal him fully. Sophia, who had grown to care for Emmanuel, urged him to go through with the procedure. "You deserve to live without pain," she said, taking his hand. "You deserve a second chance, just like we both do." Emmanuel agreed, and they flew abroad for the surgery. The procedure was a success, and as Emmanuel began to heal physically, his emotional walls came down completely. He realized that Sophia wasn't just someone he had been forced to marry. She was the partner he never knew he needed. As the weeks passed after the surgery, Emmanuel's recovery was slow but steady. He began using crutches to help him walk again. Each step was a painful reminder of how far he had fallen, but it was also a symbol of his resilience. For the first time in years, Emmanuel felt hope stirring in his chest. Sophia was by his side every day, encouraging him as he learned to walk again. She would hold his hand as he struggled with the crutches, his legs still weak from years of disuse. There were moments when frustration would overcome Emmanuel. He hated feeling vulnerable, hated relying on anyone. But every time his temper flared, Sophia remained patient, calming him with her gentle words. "You're stronger than you think, Emmanuel," Sophia would say as he practiced walking across the room. "You've survived so much. This is just one more battle." At first, Emmanuel doubted himself. Every time he stumbled or fell, he would feel a wave of anger and embarrassment. But as Sophia continued to support him, he began to realize that he didn't have to face this alone. Slowly, he accepted her help, and with it came the realization that their relationship had evolved into something far deeper than a forced marriage. One evening, Emmanuel took a walk with Sophia. He leaned heavily on his crutches, his movements slow and deliberate, but Sophia's presence gave him strength. They walked side by side through the garden, their steps in rhythm. "I used to think I was broken beyond repair," Emmanuel said quietly, his voice filled with vulnerability, "that after the accident, after everything, I wouldn't be able to live a full life again." Sophia smiled, looking up at him with warmth in her eyes. "You're not broken, Emmanuel. You're healing, and sometimes healing takes time, but that doesn't make you any less whole." For a moment, Emmanuel paused, his crutches sinking into the soft earth beneath his feet. He looked at Sophia, truly seeing her for the first time, not just as his wife, but as his partner, his anchor. She had become the person who believed in him when he couldn't believe in himself. "I don't deserve you," Emmanuel said, his voice thick with emotion, "but I'm going to spend the rest of my life proving that I do." Sophia squeezed his hand. "You don't need to prove anything. I'm here because I love you, not for who you were, but for who you are." In that moment, Emmanuel realized that the walls he had built around his heart had finally crumbled. He leaned in, resting his forehead against hers, and whispered, "I love you, Sophia, more than I ever thought possible." Tears welled up in Sophia's eyes, but they were tears of joy. She had dreamed of love her entire life, and now, here it was, real, deep, and unshakable. As Emmanuel grew stronger, he began to reflect on the role Sophia had played in his recovery, not just physically, but emotionally. He owed her more than just his gratitude. She had given him a second chance at life and love. He was determined to make their marriage one built on mutual respect and affection, not just the remnants of a business arrangement. But as much as they tried to move forward, the shadow of Sophia's past still loomed. One afternoon, while they were in the garden, Emmanuel received a phone call. It was about Sophia's father, Anthony, who was still in the hospital. His condition had worsened, and the doctors were not optimistic about his recovery. Sophia hadn't visited her father since their confrontation, but now she felt torn. She knew her father had never truly loved her, but there was still a part of her that longed for closure, even if he was on his deathbed. "You don't have to do this alone," Emmanuel said, noticing the conflicted expression on her face. He leaned on his crutches, his eyes filled with concern. "If you want to go see him, I'll be with you every step of the way." Sophia nodded, grateful for his support. She knew that this was something she had to face, not out of obligation, but for her own peace of mind. The hospital room was cold and sterile, filled with the quiet hum of medical machines. Anthony lay in the bed, looking frail and pale, a shadow of the man who had once towered over Sophia with authority and disdain. When Sophia walked into the room, Anthony's eyes flickered open. For a moment, there was confusion and then recognition. "Sophia?" His voice was weak, barely a whisper. She stood at the foot of the bed, Emmanuel by her side, leaning on his crutches. She had imagined this moment so many times, but now that it was here, she didn't feel the anger she thought she would. Instead, she felt a strange sense of calm. "I'm sorry," Anthony croaked, "for everything. I should have been a better father." Sophia stood still, her emotions swirling inside her. She had waited her whole life to hear those words, but now that they had been spoken, they didn't bring the relief she expected. "I forgive you, Papa," she said quietly, "but I've moved on. I have a life now, a family that loves me. Anthony's eyes filled with tears, and for the first time in years, Sophia saw genuine regret in them. I lost everything, he murmured. I lost you. Sophia nodded, her heart heavy, but free of the bitterness that had once filled it. Yes, she replied softly, but I found myself. With that, she paid his hospital bills and left, feeling lighter than she had in years. She had closed the door on her past, and now her future lay wide open. Back at home, Sophia and Emmanuel continued to build a life filled with love, hope, and purpose. Emmanuel's recovery was slow but steady, and eventually he moved from using crutches to walking without them. Every step he took was a testament to his determination and the love that had brought him back to life. Together, they worked on their charity, helping children who had been abandoned or orphaned, giving them the love and support they had, both lacked, growing up. Sophia, now a mother herself, poured all of her love into her family, ensuring that their daughter, Amanda, would never know the pain of being unwanted. As the years passed, Sophia and Emmanuel grew even closer, their bond stronger than ever. They knew that life would continue to bring challenges, but they also knew that as long as they had each other, they could face anything. Meanwhile, Felicia and Jordan had found themselves in a far different life. After spending all of their wealth, they had been forced to take on menial jobs just to survive. Felicia cleaned houses and Jordan worked odd jobs, their luxurious lifestyle a distant memory. They spent their days filled with regret, watching from afar as the daughter they had scorned now lived a life filled with love and happiness. One day, as they sat in their small apartment, they saw a news segment featuring Sophia and Emmanuel. The couple was being honored for their work in the community, helping children in need. Sophia looked radiant, full of life and joy, while Emmanuel stood proudly by her side, a man transformed by love. As Felicia and Jordan watched, shame filled their hearts. They had chased after wealth and status, only to lose everything. Meanwhile, the girl they had once mistreated had found the true riches in life, love, kindness, and a family that cherished her. Sophia and Emmanuel had learned the most important lesson of all, that love could heal even the deepest wounds, and that together they could create a future brighter than they had ever imagined. The end. Thanks for listening.